Speaking of warriors for truth and scientific transparency in Washington, D.C., Mark Morano, who many people here know to be the communications director for the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee and a senior aide to Senator James Inhofe, has just been named executive editor and chief correspondent for the Climate News Center, a project of the Committee for a Constructive Tomorrow. Is Mark here in the room this morning? Stand up, Mark. Mark will be speaking on a panel at 10:30 this morning, either at the panel or at whatever point in time throughout the conference. I encourage you all to take the opportunity to introduce yourself to Mark and plan on working with him in the future. You do a great job, Mark. As Joe Bast mentioned last night, not a penny of corporate money is funding this 2009 International Conference on Climate Change. Compare that to the UN conference being held later this week in Copenhagen, supplementing the IPCC. The UN conference has 8 sponsors who contributed enough money to be given quote-unquote star status, comprising a who's who among the renewable power and carbon offset industries. Assertions that skeptics are corrupted by ties to corporate donors, while alarmists are as pure as the driven snow and devoid of corporate influence, ring quite hollow given the funding of the 2 global warming conferences this week. With this in mind, I was amused to pick up this morning's New York Times and read their coverage of this conference. They seem to focus on 2 topics: funding and internal debate. It's quite amusing that whenever a group of skeptics get together, whether or not there is any corporate funding involved, and in this case there is not, nevertheless, paragraph upon paragraph of the article is dedicated to alleged corporate funding. Whereas when the news media covers the IPCC, regardless of the fact that the renewable power industry and the corporate offset industry is giving enough money to be listed as star sponsors, these corporate funding sources are largely ignored. Similarly, this morning's article talked about internal debate within the skeptic movement. On the one hand, we have a group of skeptics that encourage open debate, not just in regard to the alarmists, but among each other. There are varying competing theories as to why the planet has warmed moderately of late. We have plain natural variation. We have perhaps a solar influence. We have perhaps changes in ocean currents. There are many reasons that can explain this. The fact that we do not insist upon a single explanation that we are going to stand by come hell or high water is not a sign of weakness, it's a sign of strength. I encourage you to compare that, for example, to Michael Mann giving a talk even today in which he will assert that the snows of Kilimanjaro are disappearing due to global warming. As many of you know, scientists have studied this extensively and have determined that there is no link between global warming and the receding alpine glacier at Kilimanjaro. Yet, because internal debate is something that the alarmists fear, Michael Mann and others are going to continue to make that argument regardless of what the science says. Here in this room, we do not insist upon such a party line. We encourage open debate, and I applaud you all for that. For anyone who still may doubt the motives of skeptics, I invite you to consider our next keynote speaker. Lawrence Solomon is one of Canada's leading environmentalists. He helped found the World Rainforest Movement, Friends of the Earth Canada, and Lake Ontario Waterkeepers. Mr. Solomon is a founder and managing editor of Energy Probe Research Foundation, a proponent of conservation and renewable energy, and a critic of coal, nuclear power, and large-scale hydro dams. Energy Probe Research Foundation works with citizens groups around the world to stop environmentally and economically destructive projects and promote sound development. In a refreshing and inspiring example of personal integrity, Mr. Solomon set out to interview many of the impeccably credentialed scientists who are skeptical of the asserted global warming crisis. He published excerpts of these interviews in a long-running series in Canada's National Post, and then pulled together a comprehensive selection of these interviews in his 2008 best-selling book, The Deniers. In so doing, Mr. Solomon gave a public voice to the scientists whose skepticism regarding the alleged global warming crisis is frequently overlooked in the media. Lawrence Solomon's commitment to truth, eagerness to investigate all sides of an issue, and desire to transcend preconceived notions inspire all of us, no matter what our pre-existing notions are on environmental or any other issues, to constantly question our own assumptions and subject ourselves to the same critical inquiry that we seek regarding others. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Mr. Lawrence Solomon.
Thank you, James, for that introduction. I'd like to start by expressing my appreciation to everyone here at Heartland for organizing this wonderful gathering. Last night was outstanding. I hope I can shed a little light on one aspect of last night's discussion, the part dealing with environmentalism. My speech this morning will be like no other I've ever given. Usually, I'm in a room speaking to concerned citizens or students or people in the energy industry or members of the general public. And my task is to explain that people like you exist, that credible scientists, policymakers, and others who are not in the pay of Exxon actually believe that man-made global warming is not leading us to catastrophe. You may be surprised to learn that it isn't difficult to convince people that you exist. I was surprised when I give speeches, when I talk to friends and neighbors in my own neighborhood, which happens to be the most left-wing neighborhood in Canada. When I talk to the press, when I talk to colleagues, people are quite prepared to believe that there is no consensus that man is responsible for climate change. My audiences are sometimes perplexed to learn that you exist because they haven't heard this before. But they are prepared to believe that you exist and that you're not the work of the devil. It's clear to me that most people do not have great conviction about global warming. Now, you may be especially surprised that among those without great convictions as to global warming, among those who don't dispute my claims, are my colleagues in the environmental movement. As James mentioned, I head one of Canada's largest environmental organizations. And in many ways, it's what most of you would expect an environmental organization to be. We are opponents of nuclear power, proponents of conservation and renewable energy, critics of urban sprawl. We're concerned about third world development. My organization was perhaps the first in Canada to warn about the potential dangers of climate change. That was in the late 1980s. We were there at the Rio conference in 1992 that Al Gore organized. We were there along with thousands of other environmental organizations. So my colleagues, in other words, are environmentalists, the very people that many of you see as ideologues. Some, of course, are ideologues. Their views conform exactly to the stereotype of them that you might have. But many are not. Many are potential allies. They believe there's a scientific consensus on climate change for the same reason that members of the general public do. That's what they hear in the press. And when I talk to them or communicate with them, what do they say when I tell them that you all exist and that I think your views are credible? Some say the equivalent of, so what? If it helps to get rid of fossil fuels, they say, and if it helps to bring in renewable energy, what's the harm? They don't like automobiles especially. They don't like suburban sprawl. They don't like smog. They see Kyoto as doing good, even if for the wrong reasons. That's some environmentalists. Other environmentalists aren't all that happy about Kyoto. They don't have a global warming agenda. Their passion might be the quality of drinking water, or landfill sites, or the design of public transit systems, areas that have little to do with Kyoto's grand plans. But because their funders want to see global warming proposals, they need to skew their work to give it a global warming angle. They don't dare speak up for fear of losing their funding. And they also fear losing their credibility. And ironically, at the same time, some of them fear that all environmentalists will be losing their credibility should global warming turn out to be a hoax. If and when global warming comes to be seen as a hoax, the reasons for the change in public attitudes could be many, and you're familiar with many of these. It could be that global cooling causes the doomsayers to lose credibility. It could be carbon taxes that hit people in the pocketbook. It could be blackouts caused by over-reliance on wind power and solar power. It could be the next great scare, maybe our economy tanking, maybe a new Y2K, maybe a new environmental scare. And it could be opposition to Kyoto by environmental groups themselves. My foundation has a large third world wing. It's called Probe International. It works at a grassroots level with groups in the third world. And these groups are up in arms over what Kyoto is doing to them and to their communities. Kyoto, or trying to comply with Kyoto, has emerged as the single biggest destroyer of the environment. So you've heard of carbon offsets. Well, the other half of that transaction is the purchase of a carbon sink, and that carbon sink is very often in the third world. It's often something like a eucalyptus plantation. Eucalyptus is a fast-growing tree. It's efficient at pulling carbon out of the air, and it's favored by many who push these carbon schemes. Well, to get the land for that eucalyptus plantation, farmers in the third world are often evicted from their land, typically without fair compensation. Or an old-growth forest will be torn down and replaced with a eucalyptus plantation. And when you lose an old-growth forest, you lose not only its environmental amenities, the forest people are being evicted from their homes too, again without compensation. The number of people who get displaced by carbon schemes can be much larger when hydro dams are involved. Sometimes tens of thousands of people are flooded off their land. In the case of the Three Gorges Dam, the number is in the millions. Often this involves the loss of some of the most fertile land that a country will have. Before Kyoto, it was very hard for third world governments to build new hydro dams. Hydro dams had stopped being economic decades ago. All the economic sites had already been developed. But now with Kyoto and the subsidies that it's bringing in, dams are back, and they're back in the hundreds. The subsidies make dams financially feasible for the developers. And now people in local communities they're being told they can't fish and they can't farm along their rivers anymore because a dam's coming in, and the dam is needed, their governments are telling them, to stop global warming. Well, environmentalists in the third world aren't buying it. They're protesting at the loss of their valleys, their forests. They're organizing through their church groups, through their labor unions, through their local governments, and they're becoming a force to be reckoned with. Now, these environmentalists in the third world aren't ideologues. They're basically fighting for their property rights. This is the case with most of the environmental battles involving third world groups that my organization works with. And I'd say in the West, most environmentalists aren't ideologues either. Most don't want to turn the clock back on progress. They're not at all Luddites. I think that's a small percentage of the environmental movement. Environmentalism is essentially, and I think it's traditionally been, a conservative movement. It's not inherently radical. It's driven largely by health and safety concerns. That's why there's been such a focus on organic foods and clean energy over the decades. And it's driven by a fear that we're creating environmental liabilities for our children in the form of future love canals or nuclear waste facilities. You can disagree with environmentalists' perception of risk. They probably are more risk-averse than the population as a whole. But that's not an ideological trait. That said, I don't disagree with President Klaus and Dr. Lindzen when they describe the political nature of their adversary. I just think that we all need to peek behind the curtain to see who the real adversaries are. Starting in the 1980s, labor unions moved into the environmental arena in a big way. And I think the reason they did that was to stop the trend to privatization and economic deregulation that environmentalists were abetting. And then, perhaps more significantly, in the 1990s, large foundations changed the way they related to the environmental groups and probably the rest of the charitable community. Until then, the large foundations had been reactive. They would receive proposals, funding proposals from, say, environmental organizations, and they would decide to fund them or not. Then they became proactive. They started to set priorities for the environmental movement, and probably in other sectors as well. The large funders have their own conferences at which they decide what the priorities for society should be. Many of them act in concert. They often then encourage the various environmental groups to form coalitions or to run joint projects, and they even assign different roles for them, what parts they can play in the campaigns. And they do this on the rationale that funds are scarce and they have to eliminate duplication. So everyone is assigned their own niche. In effect, the funders have usurped the role of the charities, or 501c3s as they're known here, by often dictating the policies to be implemented. Environmental groups, in many cases, have become pawns of funders, or they become, in effect, consultants to the funders. If there is organization and coordination, a kind of orchestration in the environmental movement, it is more at this funding level. And it is especially more at this funding level that politics and ideology plays a large role. And because there's so much money there in these foundations, that money is levered to a great extent. And I think what we're all seeing is the leverage that money has. Still, I'm confident that the skeptics are winning. Joe referred to a Rasmussen poll last night that showed most Americans don't believe man is the cause of global warming. I have cheery news on that front. from Canada. First, we had a federal election recently in which the political party that has dominated Canadian politics over the last century made carbon pricing a major election issue. That party suffered a humiliating defeat. It was their biggest defeat since 1867, which was the year that Canada was founded. The other cheery news is a poll, it's a Canadian poll taken on climate change to see why Canadians take the positions they do on climate change. It was essentially a poll about their knowledge of people like you. A huge number of Canadians had no idea that there was any dissent among scientists. And not surprisingly, of those Canadians who thought there was no dissent, they were worried about global warming. But of those Canadians who had heard just twice that man's role in global warming was in doubt, just twice, they became skeptics. So this explains why only 11% of Czechs aren't skeptics. They've heard skepticism more than twice from their president. So the answer for what all the scientists in this room need to do in our own countries now becomes clear. We need to clone Klaus. Thank you.